One of the reasons why learning a language is so hard is because when we learn the new language, we're focusing on translating what we already know into the new language, but sometimes things work differently. One of the areas in which that is different and which is the use of the tenses. Even though in one language we might use a particular tense for a particular context, in the other language, perhaps we don't need to use that tense, or perhaps there are other tenses that are more natural. So this particular question came from one of our podcast guests, and I wanted to spend just a minute explaining how it works and what you can do to make your life simpler. So the question is, how do you use haber in Spanish? So if you're not familiar, this works both ways, both directions. If you're learning English, this works for you as well. So haber translates into the perfect tense of have. Remember that in English, have has two different components: have of having, owning, possessing, or have the auxiliary that we use for questions, for perfect tenses. So for example, have you been to Miami, right? Is very complex because Spanish has two different verbs for that. So we have verb for possess, which is tener, which is an active verb. It's very easy to conjugate. I don't think there's any questions with that. I have a dog, yo tengo un perro, that translates, that matches perfectly, no crossed wires there. So no problems there. But then we have that translates to haber, which is the auxiliary component. Every time you have an auxiliary, without getting too technical and too grammar-y, you need two parts to communicate. You need the auxiliary and you need the actual action that you are talking about. So in the case of, for example, have you been to Miami, we have the auxiliary, and we have been the action of visiting. Have you visited Miami? It's similar, right? And that translates to has estado en Miami, has visitado Miami, right? So we have those two components. So what's hard to learn Spanish is that you have to learn all the versions of haber. So in the present, you have 5 versions: yo he, tú has, ellos han, ella ha. You know, you have all these versions and you have to memorize them, and that's a little bit challenging. And then the opposite happens from Spanish to English, that you have all these versions and we're not thinking about it because Spanish is our native language. So when you say he estudiado, he comido, we're not really thinking about the structure. We don't even know what a means. A lot of people think that a is a different verb than haber. So when I say haber, like, it doesn't make sense for us. So when we have to mechanize it into learning the perfect tense in English, it's hard to do. But here's what makes it even more challenging, and where if you're intermediate or advanced, you might be struggling with, which is we don't always use those perfect tenses in English in the same situations as in Spanish. So for example, have you been to Miami? In Spanish, you can say has estado en Miami, has visitado a Miami. But really what we would say in Spanish more naturally is we would avoid the perfect tense altogether and we would say, ¿ya conoces Miami? So we use the verb know for places and not just people or knowledge or facts. So yo no conozco París, yo no conozco Europa, I don't know. And so you circumvent the need to go to the perfect tense. The perfect tense in English is very good for past experiences, for the things that you've done in life, but in Spanish you don't necessarily have to go there. If you're learning Spanish from English, then here are a couple tricks every time that you have this notion, whether it's implied or if it's in the sentence even, of this already, something already happened, like for example, have you already eaten dinner? um, in Spanish, you kind of don't need the perfect tense at all. You can just say ya comiste, ya fuiste, ya terminaste, ya lograste, and then you don't need the perfect tense at all. Um, when you're talking about your life experience, like for example, um, I have all I have lived here, I have worked here for 5 years. In Spanish, you can also circumvent that, and you don't have to say yo he trabajado aquí por 5 años, which people will understand you. There's no problem there. But more natural would be trabajo aquí desde. Remember that in Spanish, you don't need to begin with the subject always. So you don't say yo trabajo aquí desde. No, you can just say trabajo aquí desde. I've lived here for the past 5 years. Yo he vivido aquí por los últimos 5 años. Yes, you can say that, but easier to say, yo vivo aquí desde el 2018. Yo he vivido aquí. Yeah, you can say that. But we don't use those terms. And even more obscure are the past perfect, the perfect continuous tenses. Yo he estado estudiando. Like that exists as a conjugation in Spanish, but most people will not communicate that way. So when you're learning language, don't be super rigid into trying to translate exactly the words that you're saying, the structure, the grammar structure of what you're saying, but try to focus on delivering the emotion and the message, and you will get it across, sometimes in an easier way with a different structure, with a different tense. And if you're learning English from Spanish, well, this is really nice for you too, because you have to take those simple versions like vivo aquí desde el 2018 and say, okay, this is a life experience. This is something that talks about my resume, the things that I have accomplished, the things that I have done. For those sensations in this type of context, when you have the already, whether it's in the sentence or implied, those are good moments to add the have as the auxiliary in English. I've been here for 5 years. I've worked in this company. I've done this kind of activities. I've been to these type of places. Those are great moments to transform that simple version into the perfect tenses. So I hope this didn't get too technical and that it was a little bit helpful. It's a longer explanation in two different formats, but I wanted to share anyways in case you find it interesting or useful. So thank you so much. And thanks to Kimmy for asking this question.